He was amused by Sebille, though nothing in her madness spoke of the gods. I liked Sebille, for I too was a Saxon, and Sebille would speak to me in my mother's tongue, so that I grew up in Innis Widrin, speaking both Saxon and the speech of the Britons. I should have been a slave, but when I was a little child, shorter even than the dwarf Druiden, a raiding party had come to Domnonia's northern coast from Siluria, and had taken the settlement where my mother was enslaved. King Gundlias of Siluria led the raid. My mother, who I think looked something like Sebille, was raped while I was carried to the death pit, where Tanaburs, Siluria's druid, sacrificed a dozen captives as thanks to the high god Bel for the great plunder the raid had yielded. Dear God, how I remember that night. The fires, the screams, the drunken rapes, the wild dancing, and then the moment when Tanaburs hurled me into the black pit with its sharpened stake. I lived, untouched, and came from the death pit as calmly as Nimue had come from the killing sea, and Merlin, finding me, had called me a child of Bel. He named me Derval, gave me a home, and let me grow free. The Tor was filled with such children, who had been snatched from the gods. Merlin believed we were special, and that we might grow into a new order of druids and priestesses who could help him re-establish the old true religion in Rome-blighted Britain. But he never had time to teach us, and so most of us grew to become farmers, fishermen, or wives. During my time on the Tor, only Nimue seemed marked by the gods, and was growing into a priestess. I wanted nothing more than to be a warrior. Pellinore gave me that ambition. Pellinore was the favourite of all Merlin's creatures. He was a king, but the Saxons had taken his land and his eyes, and the gods had taken his mind. He should have been sent to the Isle of the Dead, where the dangerous mad went, but Merlin ordered him kept on the Tor, locked in a small compound, like the one where Druiden kept his pigs. He lived naked, with long white hair that reached to his knees, and with empty eye sockets that wept. He raved constantly, haranguing the universe about his troubles, and Merlin would listen to the madness, and draw from it messages of the gods. Everyone feared Pellinore. He was utterly crazy and ungovernably wild. He once cooked one of Sebille's children on his fire. Yet oddly, I do not know why, Pellinore liked me. I would slip between the bars of his compound, and he would pet me, and tell me tales of fighting and wild hunts. He never sounded mad to me, and he never hurt me, nor Nimue. But then, as Merlin always said, we two children were especially beloved of Bel. Bel might have loved us, but Gwendolen hated us. She was Merlin's wife, now old and toothless. Like Morgan, she had great skills with herbs and charms, but Merlin had cast her off when her face became disfigured by a sickness. It had happened long before I reached the Tor, during a period everyone called the Bad Time, when Merlin had come back from the north, mad and weeping. But even when he recovered his wits, he did not take Gwendolen back, though he did allow her to live in a small hut beside the stockade fence, where she spent her days casting spells against her husband, and screaming insults at the rest of us. She hated Druiden most of all. Sometimes she would attack him with a fire spit, and Druiden would scamper through the huts with Gwendolen chasing after him. We children would urge her on, screaming for dwarfish blood. But he always got away. Such, then, was the strange place to which Rowena came with the Edling Mordred, and though I may have made it sound a place of horrors, it was in truth a good refuge. We were the privileged children of Lord Merlin. We lived free, we did little work, we laughed, and Innis Widren, the Isle of Glass, was a happy place. Norwenna arrived in winter-time, when Avalon's marshes were glossed with ice. There was a carpenter in Innis Widren called Gwilithin, whose wife had a boy-child the same age as Mordred, and Gwilithin made us sledges, and we rang the air with shrieks as we slid down the Tor's snowy slopes. Ralla, Gwilithin's wife, was appointed Mordred's wet-nurse, and the prince, despite his maimed foot, grew strong on her milk. Even Norwenna's health improved as the bitter cold abated, and the winter's first snowdrops bloomed in the thorn thickets about the sacred spring at the Tor's foot. The princess was never strong, but Morgan and Gwendolen gave her herbs, the monks prayed, and it seemed her birth sickness was at last passing. Each week a messenger carried news of the Edling's health to his grandfather, the High King, and each piece of good news was rewarded with a piece of gold, or maybe a horn of salt, or a flask of rare wine that Druiden would steal. We waited for Merlin's return, but he did not come, and the Tor seemed empty without him, though our daily life hardly changed. The storerooms had to be kept filled, and the rats had to be killed, and the firewood and spring water had to be carried uphill 3 times a day. Godovin, Merlin's scribe, kept a tally of the tenants' payments, while Howl, the steward, rode the estates to make certain no family cheated their absent lord. Godovin and Howl were both sober, hard-headed, hard-working men. Proof, Nimue told me, that Merlin's eccentricities ended where his income began. It was Godovin who had taught me to read and write. I did not want to learn such unwarrior-like skills, but Nimue had insisted.
"You're fabulous," she had told me, "and you'll have to make your way on your own skills."
"I want to be a soldier."
"You will be,"
she promised me.
"but not unless you learn to read and write."
And such was her youthful authority over me that I believed her, and learned the clerkly skills long before I discovered that no soldier needed them. So, Godovin taught me letters, and Howl, the steward, taught me to fight. He trained me with the single stick, the countryman's cudgel that could crack open a skull, but which could also mimic the stroke-play of a sword or the thrust of a spear. Howl, before he lost a leg to a Saxon axe, had been a famous warrior in Uther's band, and he made me exercise until my arms were strong enough to wield a heavy sword with the same speed as a single stick. Most warriors, Howl said, depended on brute force and drink instead of skill. He told me I would face men reeling with mead and ale, whose only talent was to give giant blows that might kill an ox, but a sober man, who knew the 9 strokes of the sword, would always beat such a brute. "I was drunk," he admitted, "when Octher, the Saxon, took my leg. Now, faster, lad, faster! Your sword must dazzle them! Faster!" He taught me well, and the first to know it were the monks' sons in Innis Widren's lower settlement. They resented we privileged children of the Tor, for we idled when they worked and ran free while they laboured, and as revenge they would chase us and try to beat us. I took my single stick to the village one day and hammered 3 of the Christians bloody. I was always tall for my age, and the gods had made me strong as an ox, and I ascribed my victory to their honour, even though Howl whipped me for it. The privileged, he said, should never take advantage of their inferiors. But I think he was pleased all the same, for he took me hunting the next day, and I killed my first boar with a man's spear. That was in a misty thicket by the River Cam, and I was just 12 summers old. Howl smeared my face with the boar's blood, gave me its tusks to wear as a necklace, then carried the corpse away to his temple of Mithras, where he gave a feast to all the old warriors who worshipped that soldier's god. I was not allowed to attend the feast, but one day, Howl promised me, when I had grown a beard and slain my first Saxon in battle, he would initiate me into the Mithraic mysteries. 3 years later, I still dreamed of killing Saxons. Some might have thought it odd that I, a Saxon youth with Saxon-coloured hair, was so fervently British in my loyalty. But since my earliest childhood, I had been raised among the Britons, and my friends, loves, daily speech, stories, enmities, and dreams were all British. Nor was my colouring so unusual. The Romans had left Britain peopled with all manner of strangers. Indeed, Mad Pellinore once told me of 2 brothers who were both black as charcoal, and until I met Sagramore, Arthur's Numidian commander, I thought his words were mere lunacy, weaving romance. The tour became crowded once Mordred and his mother arrived, for Norwenna brought not only her women attendants, but also a troop of warriors, whose task was to protect the Edling's life. We all slept 4 or 5 to a hut, though none but Nimue and Morgan were allowed into the hall's inner chambers. They were Merlin's own, and Nimue alone was permitted to sleep there. Norwenna and her court lived in the hall itself, which was filled with smoke from the 2 fires that burned day and night. The hall was supported by 20 oak posts, and had walls of plastered wattle and a thatched roof. The floor was of earth, covered by rushes, that sometimes caught fire and caused a panic until the flames had been stamped out. Merlin's chambers were separated from the hall by an internal wall of wattles and plaster, pierced by a single small wooden door. We knew that Merlin slept, studied, and dreamed in those rooms that culminated in a wooden tower built at the Tor's highest point. What happened inside the tower was a mystery to everyone but Merlin, Morgan, and Nimue, and none of those 3 would ever tell, though the country people, who could see Merlin's tower for miles around, swore it was crammed with treasures taken from the grave mounds of the old people. The chief of Mordred's guard was a Christian named Legezac, a tall, thin, greedy man, whose great skill was with the bow. He could split a twig at 50 paces when he was sober, though he rarely was. He taught me some of his skill, but he became easily bored with a boy's company, and preferred to gamble with his men. He did, however, tell me the true tale of Prince Mordred's death, and thus the reason why High King Uther had cursed Arthur. "It wasn't Arthur's fault," Legezac said, as he tossed a pebble onto his throw-board. All the soldiers had throw-boards, some of them beautifully made out of bone. "6," he said, while I waited to hear the story of Arthur. "W," Manu, one of the prince's guards, said, then rolled his own stone. It rattled over the board's ridges and settled on a 1. He'd only needed a 2 to win, so now he scooped his pebbles off the board and cursed. Legezac sent Manu to fetch his purse to pay his winnings. Then he told me how Uther had summoned Arthur from Armorica to help defeat a great army of Saxons that had thrust deep into our land. Arthur had brought his warriors, Legezac said, but none of his famous horses, for the summons had been urgent, and there had been no time to find enough ships for both men and horses. "Not that he needed horses," Legezac said admiringly, "because he trapped those Saxon bastards in the Valley of the White Horse. Then Mordred decided he knew better than Arthur. He wanted all the credit, you see."